Okay, then on behalf of White Plus, I would like to welcome you to this webinar. Thank you for joining us. Let me first introduce briefly White Plus. White Plus is a feminist European network of associations and activists that fight for women's and gender rights as part of larger struggle for social justice, sustainable development, livelihoods and human rights. White Plus aims to promote collective feminist movement building in Europe in solidarity with like-minded feminist organizations elsewhere. My name is Christa Wichterich. I'm a member of White Plus and a scholar activist on gender justice. Presently, I'm teaching an international course on global care chains at the University of Kassel in Germany. Before I start introducing the topic and speakers of this webinar, I would like to briefly mention some practicalities. For this webinar, we have 1 hour and 45 minutes time. After each speaker, we allow for some questions, and in the end, we aim to have an interactive discussion. If you want to ask a question or post a comment, you can use the chat section at the bottom of your panel. You can also use that if you want to share your work pertaining to this webinar. In the hopes that we have enough time for all questions, we also facilitate live contributions from the audience. So if you want to take the floor and ask your questions through audio or video, kindly indicate this in your question or comment in the chat. Unfortunately, it is impossible to ask questions to the panelists via Facebook. We are committed to a friendly feminist exchange and interaction. As organizers, we reserve our right to exclude anyone who uses offensive or discriminatory language or who abuses this space in an undemocratic or anti-feminist way. We will be live streaming this webinar and will be making this webinar available afterwards, including any slides. If you want to remain anonymous while asking a question or comment, we suggest you rename yourself with anonymous or another pseudonym in the Zoom profile. So let us come to the topic of this webinar. The COVID-19 pandemic has been with us for more than 1 year. It has exacerbated social, economic, and gender inequalities across the world. Many of us, and women in particular, are exhausted by the fight against the pandemic, by the lockdown measures, by trying to combine paid work and care, by the political debates around the response to the pandemic and the recovery planning. At White Plus, we saw an urgent need to create spaces for joint feminist reflections about the new normal of life in and after the pandemic. In a series of 3 webinars, we reflect about some of the main topics of feminist concerns around COVID-19. The first webinar, 2 weeks ago, focused on paid and unpaid work in the crisis situation and on recovery packages. Last week, we addressed the topic of migrant care work in transnational care chains. Today, we will focus on governance and political responses to the pandemic regarding democratic rights, human, women's, and gender rights. Everywhere, we experience features of a strong state that introduces restrictions allegedly or truly for the sake of the health of the nation and protection of the citizens. This kind of a strong hand or authoritarian policies, however, carries a risk of breaking up democratic structures, of shaping regressive models of family, parenthood, and in particular motherhood, and of cutting back sexual and reproductive rights. Today, we would like to embark on a journey to 4 countries in 4 continents, where states instrumentalize the COVID-19 crisis to increase repression on civil society, to curb democratic procedures, to adopt new laws which cut down political freedom and labor rights, to introduce draconian measures of control over the bodies of its citizens and citizens, in particular women and LGBTIQ people, and in the worst case scenario, even use military force like in El Salvador. In Indonesia and Ghana, the present governments have not been particularly autocratic or undemocratic until now, but still they are using the insecure and uncertain situation during COVID-19 pandemic to advance the state's monopoly in the use of force and slash citizens' rights and freedoms. The picture the four country reports will create is very disparate, heterogeneous and diverse. However, certain patterns of authoritarianism become obvious. We as feminists are very much concerned that at least part of this could become a new normal in many countries after the pandemic. We want to reflect which conclusions we can draw for our larger struggle for social justice, sustainable livelihoods, and human and, of course, women's and gender rights. We have here four excellent speakers today. Let me first call upon Jennifer Ramme. Jennifer is researcher at the European University Viadrina, Germany, and Collegium Polonicum, Poland, and member of the Institute for European Studies. She has widely published on sexual and gender politics, right-wing populism, feminism, and feminist nationalism, LGBTIQ and feminist movements and protest in Poland. Jennifer will speak now about the recent tightening of the abortion law in Poland and feminist and queer resistance against it. The floor is yours, Jennifer.
Okay. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. And I'm super happy that we're in this international round to kind of discuss those authoritarian tendencies. I just have to, 1 second. I'm here on full screen. Okay. Yeah, as you probably, many of you have heard about Poland because there have been like recent, like those mass protests, and Poland is in the medias over and over again because of this also challenging like LGBTQ rights and women rights over and over again. But Poland is also one of the countries which is having a backslide in democratic standards in general. And Gea, could you please put the slide? And this is a project by an institution, a research project called FAUDEM Liberal. It's a democracy index where you can see that signs like the new right-wing government took over, there's a downslide of like democratic principles in many areas. And can you put the next? And you can see like, when you see like how the development is, Poland is a country where like also worldwide, you can see this progress is like really fast according to this index. And it's in many areas, like there have been a party to take over the media, like the public media, which is under the control of the government. Then the rule of law is partly kind of dismantled, like the constitutional court. There are doubts if it's really independent or if it's on political influence. And the free elections, they are still there, but in the last elections, you could see like, because the media is controlled by the government, there was a lot of propaganda. It's like super one-sided. So it's kind of doubts if it's really like super fair. So, and also like this till now, like the rule of assembly, like in the civil society could function, but they were like, the funds were cut a lot after the right wing took over. And this is what, if you can, yeah, put the next. This is what really much changed with the pandemic, that this issue of freedom of assembly kind of got restricted really drastically. And before there were problems with LGBTQ assemblies, which like local governments tried to always restrict, but didn't succeed most of the time. But now with the pandemic, it was possible to restrict the freedom of assembly almost altogether. And you can see this is like the law by now, that you can have like a minimum of 5 participants, and they have to be like 100 meters distance in a public space, which is a lot. And also, like when the pandemic started, the fees were just incredibly high. If you can put the next. And you can see there's a high discrepancy according to other measures. So like right now, for example, the hotels can open, and there are gatherings in the church. Like the church, they can have gatherings, like, you know, the distance have to be only 15 meters, even it's in a closed space. So you can see there are different treatments of different groups. And yeah, if you can put the next. And so this is kind of the background and the situations when like this freedom of assembly was kind of restricted, when there was made the decision of the Constitutional Court to restrict the abortion law. And so there's like the suspicion that the government used the situation in the pandemic in order that people could not organize protests like they did before in 2016, where there have been massive protests. And actually the right wing got a bit scared and didn't decide to push their vision further. But now like they did. And despite there were massive protests, like the ruling was published in January. If you can put the next. So now like abortion got very, very restricted. And before you could have an abortion also like when the fetus was damaged. And now like this last of 3 option was made away. And this was 90% of the abortions that happened in Poland. So it's a very strict law. And now only when you can prove that there's a rape or when there's a threat to life and the life of the pregnant person, then it's only possible. But it's really hard to exercise those laws. If you can make the next. So yeah, so I would like also to tell something about the like background of all of this, and also the ideological framework, which is like part of those developments. And prior to this ruling of the court, there have been many debates about like a project called Against Organic Abortion, which was linked also to the idea to restrict abortion, which is very similar to what happened now with the ruling of the Constitutional Court. And this is linked very much to the idea of like right-wing feminist nationalism and yeah, discourses about like Poland being, you know, there's a genocide on the Polish people done by abortion. It's very much linked to kind of different politics of fear going on. If you can make the next. And yeah, so the rhetorics of fear they have a very, very long tradition, like going on even to the pre-war, like the frameworks are coming from even like times pre the Second World War. And they're about like protecting the family and nation. And this is because of Polish nationalism is very specific, like organizing about the idea of family being like the place where the nation is protected, not that much on the state. So we have a lot of conflicting nationalism, like civic nationalism, and like this feminist and Catholic nationalism, and a lot of like past traumatized trying to revive it. And a lot of people really fear that the nation is endangered, and they kind of don't see where the borders of the nation are. Different fears are evoked, even also through media propaganda. And the idea of organic abortion kind of links to it. Yeah, if you could make the next. And this is also linked a lot. Of course, we had the Polish Pope, John Paul, but also like, yeah, it's really, really old. So there's this idea also, if a woman makes an abortion, she can be seen like as a national traitor because she's like has the job to preserve the nation. And so you can see like it's a very, very long tradition, also rooted in the Catholic Church. Maybe you can make the next. Yeah, so and when we look at all those measures that happened after 2015, when we had the democratic downslide, it's not only about like the rule of law or the media, but it's also a lot about gender equality and LGBTQ rights. And LGBTQ rights and gender equality are very much intertwined. And this is also due to this feminist ideology in Poland, that it links it to the nation. Yeah, that these are like issues coming together. And you can see like the abortion struggle is like the most visible, an intense struggle, but you can see it's like on all areas, you can see there are problems made. It's like a salami tactic that you can see like on all the areas, the rights are kind of limited down and down and down. So it's really hard to fight it. And yeah, for example, in the LGBTQ area, you could see like there was this huge problem with this regional declarations of against so-called LGBT ideology. This is just an extreme example that the abortion right is just one of the issues, that there's a struggle. There are also this tries to introduce laws against homosexual propaganda and things like this. Yeah, so it all comes together. And I mean, the government did a lot of very positive measurements, like supporting financially families. But if you look at the context, that at the same time, like violence against women is like they try to withdraw the Istanbul Convention. If you see it all together, you can see like it's really placed into this right-wing feminist framework, where a certain family is only supported, which is like a heteronormative couple. Yeah, like LGBT parents would have problems with the citizenship of their children being accepted as Polish. So you can really see it's a different measuring who is the family and who not. Maybe you can make the next. And yeah, in the current situation, like we had those massive protests, and despite them, like this ruling was published. So the protests are continuing, but they are getting like smaller and smaller amounts of people getting attending, also because it's a difficult time. It's like winter and the repression is getting higher and higher. And also like, so this is like one problem. And the other is also that people now, because the elections, the next will be like maybe in 3 years, people are now searching for alternative, what to do in a situation when you cannot kind of use the legal way. What can people do? So there are attempts, for example, there was the social council built by the women's strike, where people discuss like how we want to have our future society, like searching for alternatives. But many people getting filed, and there's a lot of struggle through like the legal system. Yeah, so all the people organizing demonstrations are basically having some problems and have to face it. Most of the cases are wins from what I hear, but still it's like really taking a lot of time. And there are efforts to kind of make the law more repressive, to have a legal ground to repress protesters even more. Maybe you can make the next. And here I just wanted to show you how those repressions kind of escalated and what kind of how they look like. For example, people would be arrested, or they would take to the police stations outside of the city of Warsaw into other cities around, like in the middle of the night. And then in the winter they would just put them out. They could leave the police station in the middle of the night in the winter, but with no public transport home. So like participating in the protest basically means that you have to have a lot of time, that you might stand in the cold. Yeah, it's like this whole kind of packet. Yeah, so many people are just getting exhausted of the protest, or might be afraid to take part, or don't have the time to take part in so many. And there are countless charges, but still there's also a lot of solidarity, like lawyers who help people for free. So we can also see like this whole wave of people really getting mobilized in building the solidarity networks. And maybe you can make the next. No, sorry, back. I think we are somewhere else. No, that's fine. We can stay with this. So yeah, so despite like the very difficult situation now that the election have been all like won by the right wing, still there are like ideas to kind of propose some alternatives and we have like two, I would say, two movements. One is towards like a traditionalization, like authorization of the state and the society. And the other hand, we have this liberalization and we have this pluralization, and people are getting more like having, the mindset is really changing of the people. So we speak a lot about like having a kind of cultural revolution too, but in the same time, the state gets more authoritarian. So they're like contesting really movements. So we really have to keep in mind that Poland is a super divided society right now, and there's a lot of social antagonism going on. So there's this idea to make this more liberal law that was proposed by several organizations, also the women's strike, but it has a little chances to go through. And the idea is to have this complete liberal, like having abortion on demand. And it's very much also like inspired by the Argentinian struggle. If you can make the next. Yeah, so this leads me on almost to the end already. So it's kind of the question, what could happen in this situation right now with the pandemic? And as I already mentioned, what happened like starting from 2016 and what we could see now, even like intensifying, that we're having this mass movement building up, like a really feminist mass movement we didn't have before. And now like 2020 in the fall, it even like mobilized more and more parts of the society, especially like people from the parts that are those typical, what you could consider more voters of the right wing, and also a lot of young people. And so there's this deep cultural change towards gender and LGBT equality. Oops, if you could go back. Yeah. So, and there's a big loss of influence of the Catholic Church. So this is really important. On the other hand, like it's the question, if we have 3 years to go, the authoritarian like dismantling of the state can go really, really far. And it's the question, are there like free elections in 3 years? We don't know. It's like just so much time to really introduce hard changes. So yeah, but there are some signs that there are, for example, intense like conflicts within the political parties, like within the political coalition of the far right. And yeah, so we have to see what will happen. But yeah, the situation in Poland is very, very difficult and like really moving in towards two direction. And yeah, and a lot of will depend really on the European Union if they start to react more like firm, and also if this authoritarian tendency will not also like progress in other European countries. So this is maybe the most dangerous thing, that the situation will evolve in a similar direction in some other countries, and that they will be able to make more a right-wing bloc. Yeah, so this is like, but the thing that we have this very young generation like being very open and like struggling for LGBT and women rights gets a lot of hope, because these are the people who like will be there in the future. So I would like to stop with this more optimistic words. And yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Krista, you're muted.
Sorry. I was thanking Jennifer for this well-focused and at the same time comprehensive insight in the attack of the Polish state, which turns out to be more and more right-wing, conservative, nationalistic, and becoming more and more anti-democratic, and attacking sexual and reproductive gender rights in the corona situation. And thank you as well for this historic contextualization, because this is very valuable to understand the current situation. Indeed, we need some hope, which you try to give us, highlighting the strong resistance which is going on. Yeah, do we have questions for Jennifer regarding Poland? Okay, if there's no question, then I would like to ask you, for us as feminists in Europe as well, it is difficult to understand that many Polish women support the government. And you pointed already at some financial measures of the state to support mothers in difficult situations. But still, could you a bit further explain this, why women support this legislation? Is it a generational issue, or is it a kind of class issue? Can you please explain a bit further?
I don't think we can say, like, in general that women support it, but there are, of course, some women who support such legislation. And when you have the supporters of the government, you can see that there's really an age difference. So the government who has those measures is really much supported by an elderly generation and maybe even this more conservative generation. And you're having like this kind of a group of women who are very religious and kind of support this more conservative ideas. But of course, like, the thing that the party kind of provided this financial support makes a big difference. And it's something like what is very usual in the European Union to have those support structures. And they have been all dismantled during the transformation in socialist times. And so what the party did is kind of actually, addressing some of the problems, but they didn't address it in a systemical way. But it's for sure a reason why many women also support it, because it actually helps them to survive financially. But now, like, the other parties also kind of having the similar like ideas about introducing those social issues, but it might be a big problem that, for example, many other parties didn't have those ideas previously so prominent to having this family support. And it's a little bit like this carrot stick strategy, so that at one side you kind of give something nice, but on the other side you're taking rights away. So there are different reasons, but you can see that, for example, the strike, women's strike, is very much also supported by supporters of PiS, and it was like 70%, according to some polls, 70% of the people like supporting the strike. So there can be people who will support the party for one reason, but won't support it for the other. And it's also the question of what are the alternatives, and the political opposition is not really able to kind of be so, gathering around similar issues. And so I see here like really the difference, and there's this generational difference is there for sure. Like, there's such a gap, a generational gap. And you can see it also in the support of the far right. And this is very also specific for Poland, that you can see that the radical far right is more supported by young men, while the young women are really like having completely different worldviews. And I'm not sure if it's a class issue. It's very often portrayed like this, but I think it's, if you look at the statistics, it's not such a big difference. So, you have supporters from all classes of the right wing. So I would not really put it down to a class issue, because I don't think it, because if you look who are the people who kind of support like also this kind of feminist nationalism, you can see it's people, it's the Catholic Church, it's like really elites, like institutions that have been ruling in Europe, over hundreds of years, and also having and using the family idea as a way to kind of legitimize their right to power. So it's a very undemocratic force. And it's kind of this also a bit propaganda that this is representing the ordinary people. Those politics are representing ordinary people. But if we really look at who pushes those like agendas, it's not like ordinary people. It's really like very powerful institutions or organizations who support colonialism, like in the past, having like this background, or like the Catholic Church, or like even this kind of fascist ideologies are coming back. So
yes, Thank you very much. This is a very common argument that it is representing the common people or the majority, or a silent, the silent majority. Yes, I think since the time is running and you covered with your answer already quite a broad range of the society, I would like to invite you to travel with us further, and I mean quickly to Central America, to another country, which is famous for an extremely strict anti-abortion law. Paradigmatic, and this is El Salvador. Paradigmatic was the famous case of Evelyn Hernandez, who became pregnant after a rape and had a miscarriage. She was accused of abortion and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Now she's free, but this court case is outstanding in history for what this kind of strict law can do. And I'm afraid we have to come back to the Catholic Church or to Christian churches in this case as well. Roxana Calderon will speak about El Salvador, her country of origin. Roxana is a master's student of global political economy and development at the University of Kassel, Germany. Originally from El Salvador, Roxana has over 10 years of work experience in multinational corporations and development agencies. Presently, the core of her research is within the feminist paradigm on global care chains of Central American migrants. Roxana will speak about the militarization and the instrumentalization of women to cope with social tensions and social costs in El Salvador during the pandemic. Roxana, it's your floor.
Thank you, Krista, for that very nice introduction. And also I would like to thank White Plus for the opportunity that they granted me for giving my input in the series of webinars. And to give a brief, to continue with today's topic, I will speak about President Bukele's authoritarian regime during the COVID pandemic in El Salvador. This research was guided by the question, how has the pandemic reinforced masculinized ideologies and consolidated class power? So we can start. To give a brief context on the country's political history, El Salvador is a country that comes from a 12-year civil war that took place during the 1980s, where at the end, political forces were polarized in two main political parties, the left, which was the guerrilla during the conflict, and the extreme right that emerged as its opposition. After almost 30 years of this polarization, President Bukele came as a fresh post-war populist and political force in a form of a messiah, because he's coming to save Salvadorians from the abuses of these archaic political forces. With the last elections on February 28th of this year, on Legislative Assembly deputies, he gained full political power and now has no opposition. His political power dominates over the Legislative Assembly and the executive power now. With his government, there has been an increase in militarization, and public security now in El Salvador is repressive. For example, on February 9th of 2020, he arrived to the Legislative Assembly armed with military troops as a form of pressure to get approval for a $109 million loan for military equipment. And this was an act internationally qualified as one of the highest attempts to risk democracy in the country. Now, when it comes to women, they are treated as second-class citizens because there was over $6 million budget reduction in gender and class egalitarian institutions including reduction in hospital assistance in the public women's hospital. Also budget reduction for institutions dedicated for gender and less channels to denounce violence against women. During the pandemic, he made an obligatory lockdown with police and military coercion and contention centers from March 21st through June 16th of 2020, and this measure was taken with zero gender knowledge. The contention centers were basically punishments disguised as sanitary measures for people that was not compliant with the lockdown, where women didn't even have their own spaces. So with all of these points, Bukele's government is clearly authoritarian, and there has been an increase of militarization and repression, reduction of budget for equality, and relevant for this discussion is the ignorance towards specific problems of women in the lockdown situation. So next slide. During the pandemic, women's bodies were sexualized as a remedy for repression. With the lockdown, women had no escape of violence. They had aggressors inside their house and police and military forces outside to enforce the curfews. This, along with the paralyzed services that watch violence, women were trapped inside their houses, basically. However, the government was trying to reshape the image of the military, and it was the troops who were in charge of handing in bags of food to the poorest sector of the population in order to be seen as more humanitarian and helpful to the community. But because of the coercive lockdown and women being trapped with their aggressors, there were more feminicides than deaths by COVID during the first month of the lockdown. Women who were locked in their home with their aggressors represented the decriminalization of rape because more than 6,000 registered pregnancies of girls and teenagers between the age of 10 and 19 during the lockdown period. Also, 500 girls between the age of 10 and 14 gave birth in the first semester of 2020. And this combined with the decriminalization of abortion, since El Salvador continues to be one of the most radical laws in Latin America in this regard, as Krista was pointing out. In this sense, I want to raise the question, are women's bodies an instrument for lessening social tensions during the lockdown? Bukele is clearly a president that reduces women's violence to death, and he has publicly stated that women who have faced raping is something that they can work on, but by legalizing abortion, there are lives that cannot be taken back. He has desensitized the population to violence against women. Next slide, please. In this line, the state has become a manager and a supervisor of social reproduction. During the lockdown, there was a lack of access to contraceptives and reproductive rights since women could not leave their houses. But most importantly to reflect on is that population controls continues to be imposed on women's body, and it is on them the full responsibility. There were no sexual education programs before or during the confinement. So hegemonic masculinity became clear during confinement because men's uncontrollable sex desires predominated over women's sexual rights with the decriminalization of rape. But this isn't an issue caused by the pandemic, of course. These are existing problems that were unveiled and further aggravated with confinement. In this view, this crisis management has been handled by shifting the costs to the individual woman. And neoliberal knowledge that relies on masculinized ideologies and neglects practices of social reproduction relies on gendered superstructures that function as abstract subjectivities, such as gender attributes that are diffused through state policies and everyday practices. The costs of not having a welfare state is shifted to women. So the state decides over women's bodies. It controls sexual and reproductive rights along with strictly criminalizing abortion and puts full responsibility over the individual woman. When it comes to the economy, women are completely invisible. El Salvador continues with the liberal ideology in which the economy is a separate sphere from society. Bukele's pandemic management revolved around the call for stopping economic activities to secure society against the virus. And this unveils a neoliberal ideology of a self-regulating market that is separated from the social sphere, blurring how society is actually embedded in the economy. This completely neglected that 47% of women in the urban area in the informal sector work as food producers or domestic workers, and that they depend on a daily income for survival. In this perspective, the lockdown was for those who could afford it, where women broadly stated, if I stay at home, I starve. So the poorest sector of the population lives in informal housing, such as the one that you see in the slide. And it is not the same to spend the lockdown in a house full of privileges than in a house with no basic services. So the measure was taken with no class consciousness. And yeah, the neoliberal state continues to be in favor of the ruling class, and the privatized public services reduce the possibilities of survival of the poorest sector of the population. Emphasizing on domestic workers, I argue that they have turned into the contemporary serfdom class, and they have been inherently commodified in the neoliberal predominance. Over 100,000 women work as domestic workers in the urban area, some of them as live-in maids. Their earnings are between $2.50 and $15 per day, and their commodification has turned them into disposable workers, where employers ceased from their services from one day to another because of the lockdown, knowing that after the restrictive measures, they can easily find replacements. In the case of live-in maids, they were retained due to the lockdown, some of them by their own choice. But how much of a choice was it if they left knowing that they would lose their only means of sustenance? So this is an authoritarian regime that does not seek to reduce structural inequalities because of the benefits for its own image. Who would they protect if there is no disadvantaged sector, of course? And until today, there is a labor code that allows verbal contracts for domestic workers, dismissal at the will of the employer, and the minimum wage is not even guaranteed for these women. Domestic workers highly represent the intersectional inequality and legitimize the gender division of reproductive labor. Also during confinement, there was an increase of othering because employers stated that they could not risk anyone to come into their house, framing workers as externals and strangers after working for them for many years. And despite this, there is a consent of subordination from domestic workers because they know their rights, but they also know that they're in a disadvantaged position. So they know that if they demand their benefits, they can just be easily replaced. Workers do not have access to the commodity that they produce because women who clean and care for others now cannot take care of their own family. Nevertheless, those who continued retain working for their employers guaranteed the social reproduction of the upper and middle classes. And to wrap up this presentation, I will just conclude by saying that this is an authoritarian regime with increase of militarization and repressive public security, where there is repression outside and inside the house. Also, responsibility of social reproduction has been shifted to the individual woman, and in the economic sphere, where women were directly affected by the economic shutdown. This at the same time increased the devaluation and subordination of poor women as domestic workers. And this has been all from my side. I will be happy to answer some questions if there are any.
Yes, thank you very much, Roxana, for this very insightful and broad, but also, I feel, frightening picture you gave us on the authoritarian and militarized governance regime in your home country. This shows a shocking degree of brutality and surveillance of and against large sections of the population in particular poor people, in particular women, and points as the class and the gendered nature of political measures such as the lockdown. It points out as well the need for an intersectional analysis if we want to understand these inequalities. Yeah, are there questions? Yes, I see a question by Martha. El Salvador has strong feminists and women organizations recognized for their work. Can you tell us a little about their voices during the pandemic? What happened to the Makida workers? And did the Maras gangs violence increased during the lockdown or not? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that the feminist movement is now definitely gaining prominence, but continues to be widely rejected since people link social mobilization to the period of the civil conflict. Additionally, politicians and the media have completely undermined the efforts and the agency of feminist movements, portraying them sometimes even as crazy women just trying to look for a fight. But honestly, as Marta is pointing out, there are some very strong feminist movements, but it is still in women's responsibility to change this type of mindset and to change their rejection, because they are women themselves. And sometimes I feel like the population there does not give the relevance that these feminist movements should be granted with. And it's a matter of women empowering themselves and recognizing that this is something that has to be fought as a society. Also, I remember that during the pandemic, there were some maquiladoras, for example, Fiorenzi, or I don't remember exactly the name, but there was a movement, definitely. But I'm afraid that politicians really did their best to undermine the voices of these women that have been trying really hard to struggle against these structures there.
Yeah, we are of course asking as well on the background of this strong feminist movement in Argentina, yeah. Which was successful and achieved a legalization of abortion. And this, of course, is for all of us a hope and a model. Okay, then are there more? Yeah, there's a question for Roxana about migrant domestic workers. What has the government done about Salvadoran development workers, domestic workers in neighboring countries?
Well, in my own perspective, I heard nothing from the government. They didn't mention anything when it comes to domestic workers, when it comes to women. So this is why I was strongly pointing out that there was a zero gender knowledge with the measures that were taken. I was recently doing some research for my university papers, and I actually saw that there was an increase of remittances from women particularly, but it was clearly stated that this was because of the government help that they received outside from El Salvador, not from El Salvador themselves. I would even dare to say that there wasn't even any measures that were considering them and how they were doing outside their country.
Okay, thank you very much, Roxana. Now let's move on to Asia and to Indonesia and continue the discussion about livelihoods, labor, and survival under the condition of the lockdown. Kartika Manoram is a feminist activist scholar who had been involved in palm oil workers organizing work in Indonesia since 2008. She has worked with international trade unions, rural women's organizations, and human rights initiatives in accordance to support the right of workers, land rights of peasant and indigenous people. Kartika will talk about the new laws which were pushed through by the Indonesian government during COVID-19 time, while the government is criminalizing protest and re-traditionalizing gender roles. So you already see that certain patterns are coming up again. Please, Kartika.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Kartika. And first of all, I would like to say thank you for such a pleasure for me to be part of this event with all of others, the amazing speakers. And in this presentation, as Krista already mentioned, I will point out 3 issues. First is that during the pandemic, that the Indonesian government or Indonesian state has passed more than 13 controversial laws, which leads to more human and natural exploitation. And secondly, it is about the updating situation on the rising power of oligarchy and militarism in Indonesia, which has continuously attacking democracy and undermining the human rights. And thirdly, I would like to underline the tension on how the women and vulnerable groups have been oppressed and have been hit hardest in the COVID-19 timeline story. Okay, now the first slide, please. Okay. So the fact that during the pandemic, the Indonesian leaders have leveraged the crisis to obtain additional powers, as the military also has been deploying progressively to the main task force of national COVID-19 mitigation. That's how the government call it. And the oligarchy power inside the legislative and executive members work together to produce more than 13 controversial laws which lack of public participation, which I will underline 3 crucial laws as you can see in the slide. So the first one is about the job creation law or omnibus law as it's famous in Indonesia, and has hugely changed 82 laws to create jobs which basically increase competitiveness, diminishing workers' rights, support no maternity leave for women, no minimum law as well, no minimum payment, and generating more environmental damage and precarious work for the sake of economic acceleration. And the second one is the mineral mining and coal law, which has hugely changed, 90%, or I would say more than 90% of the bill favoring the extractive industry at the expense of the environmental and vulnerable communities, such as like indigenous women and local community. The critical point are that the contract holders will be allowed to automatically renew their permit to 2 times more for 10 years each. And secondly, the bill also stipulates no limit on the size of mining concession that can be granted which for mining operation in the single permit. So it could be to be more than 15 hectares for one permit. So there are no single clause about indigenous rights, even though most of the concessions are located in the indigenous lands or indigenous forests, I would say. Civil society, academia, local and indigenous people affected by the mines around the country have never been invited by the parliament to discuss the bill. And the third one is the regulation of minimum age for the constitutional judge to 60 years old, quite old, and should be retired in the age of 70 years old. And the civil society raised the notion that this law is not only a form of discrimination to the young progressive judge who are qualified as for the job for sure, but also this law will enable more complicated procedure to process judicial review on the controversial and problematic laws that has been passed during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Thank you. So during the pandemic, so during the pandemic, there are a big amount of acceleration task force of military forces in management of COVID-19. So 236 individual police officer plus 225 individual military officer list in the part of more than 100 of local task force of COVID-19. In the same time, the information and electronic transaction law is a reckless move that undermines freedom of expression in Indonesia of the civil society movement. The number of incidents involving the information law surge was increasing threefold to 233 cases since President Joko Widodo comes to the power. So Amnesty International pointed that 241 individuals were criminalized for criticizing the presidential authority administration, which most of them consider to have hate speech and insult towards the president through the social media, speeches, political protest or demonstration. Most of the social media case were brought up to the light through the police monitoring. So the police basically have a cyber army for monitoring all the civil society activities in the social media. And so and the lockdown, in the other hand, the state impunity for increasing land grabbing and reduce state capacity to monitor forests during the pandemic threatened the indigenous people, land rights, health, and well-being for sure. So it is not that there are 37 new agrarian conflicts that are mostly related to the expansion of palm oil, rubber plantation, and other natural extractive business. And more than 39 farmers and indigenous people and fishermen were arrested in connection with the conflict, while 2 were pronounced dead. And the pandemic also brought the new excuse to the police and military acts to oppress the West Papua movement and their organization. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay, so those are the pictures of omnibus law protest. And as you can see, slide in the left shows the demonstration against omnibus law in West Java. So this omnibus law protest was one of the biggest protests after 1998. And in the left side shows the demonstration against omnibus law in West Java, and on the right side it shows police brutality on the high school students who joined the omnibus law demonstration. This is the very interesting fact, in my opinion, that more than 5,200 protesters got arrested in the nationwide while joining the mass, and on top of that, 5 students has died from the torture, from the police brutality. There are also huge number of the police violence in Papua, and which correlated to the land conflict or land grabbing, I would say, for the plantation in Kalimantan, and also for the food estate policy in North Sumatra and Papua as well. Next slide, please. Okay. Yeah, so on the, if you can see on the bottom side was the women of Kandeng, who we call it like Kandeng women, who cement their feet in front of the President Palace as the riots against land conflict, which this the actor on this conflict is Indocement. It's a national-owned cement industry that supply to Heidelberg Cement in Germany. Another picture is about protest against the food estate that had initiated by the government last year. So food estate is a large-scale agricultural plantation across Indonesia, which threatens widespread deforestation and customary rights for indigenous people and their livelihood. And more than 300,000 hectares of land are being prepared for this project. And these projects are led by Prabowo. He is the Minister of Defense of Indonesia, who not only are alleged of kidnapping the activists, Indonesian activists during the Reformation 1998, but also Prabowo has also been accused of being involved in the other human rights abuse during the operation in East Timor. Next slide, please. Okay. Okay, the majority of textile women who works in Jakarta and nearby cities are migrant workers, and which age from 18 to 95 and come from outside of the fast-growing industry of textile in Jakarta, in Indonesia. And after the mass layoff due to the pandemic, most of them should come back to their hometown because they could not afford to pay the rent for housing, and most of them in this sense rejoin their perpetrators, husband, and or live together in the big family. So for workers who still working and who might have abused husband, pandemic creates more time for them to spend the time together with the tension of stress, and of course unemployment for those who got laid off, and pressure to preserve the food for the children, and of course again come back to taking care of the family's members. Data from National Women Commission of Indonesia said that 80% of female respondents on their research in the group who earning below 5 million rupiah per month experienced an increased violence during the pandemic period. And this pandemic period also has been used by the palm oil plantation, to keep the workers and all these precarious situation inside the plantation, which make it difficult for the workers to reach out for help. And since most of the women workers in plantation are undocumented, without the contract, and the workers who victimized by the union busting, this pandemic create more tension plus the level of stress to preserve food and affordable food for the children and their family. And more oppression of indigenous women also generated from the escalating numbers of land grabbing. So women in Indonesia find it difficult that less access also to sexual and reproductive health because most of the service for relating to the reproductive health in the hospital were closed, and fewer subsidized for contraception during COVID-19 made it even worse in the middle of the anti-abortion policy. And yeah, especially for women who spend more time with the abusive partner. Next slide, please.
Kartika, could you hurry up a little bit?
For sure, yeah. Okay, so transgender who face the discrimination during the pandemic, they found out that they were lost their jobs 70%, and mostly they work as a buskers, beauty salon, and sex workers. And during the pandemic, some of them go back and reunited with their families since they could not afford to rent the house or the apartment. And for those who prefer to stay in the city, will rent a house with many people inside to save the money, with the consequence to be prone of getting the virus. Since most of them run out from the house since early young age, most of them do not have national ID, which mandatory to access subsidy from the government, even though for those who have the ID state that they still even got discrimination experience from the government due to their identity. And the pictures on the left shows Sister Yuli from Trans Women Forum Alliance initiate a voluntary work to help the other trans women to get basic needs of the food. And the pictures of the right side show the housing situation of trans women community. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last slide of me, and it is clear, this is my conclusion, it is clear that the state used the pandemic to attack democracy and generate the violence of human rights. And the controversial laws that has been mentioned before accumulate the oppression, and it was difficult to organize the movement as a political expression. The limitation of space during the COVID-19 regulation plus the information and electronic transaction law will be also a challenge to organize online-based movement. In the other hand, the solidarity between civil societies and academia during the pandemic shows that social inclusivity take them together after a long segregation of issue and political position. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you. And yeah.
Thank you very much, Kartika. Thank you. Yes, you provided a very complex picture of new repressions and curtailing rights and liberties by the Indonesian government, which during the last elections was supposed to be more democratic and liberal than the competing Islamistic party. We clearly see that in the crisis situation, like in El Salvador, the weakest groups in society, women, indigenous people, LGBTIQ persons, are hit the worst regarding their livelihoods and democratic rights and freedoms. And we see patterns like restriction of labor rights. We experience this as well in India, and the slash and burn policy of tropical forest, like in Brazil, in the crisis situation for commercial purposes. Yes, are there questions for Kartika? If there are no questions, then yes, is there something?
Yeah, there's a question now.
Yeah, Hannah, please.
So there's a question from Gaia. From which ideology does the government engage in oppression and limiting services to exercise SRHR rights and of LGBTQI?
Okay, can I answer now?
Yes, sure.
Krista?
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, of course it's capitalistic, I would say. It's capitalistic, and also this new tension of oligarchy is rising up in Indonesia. So all of this, I would say, all of this controversial law produced to enable this oligarchy to extract more exploitation for the natural resources. And also, if I would like to say about reproductive health rights, since it is a long discussion, even Indonesia has been a country with anti-abortion basically, and since Indonesia is the largest Muslim community in the world, they use these religion issues to attack the using of the contraception basically. And of course, LGBTIQ movement in Indonesia has been oppressed for years and years and years. And then there was a draft of a law that basically will oppress LGBTIQ more, or I would say there is an app basically in Jakarta that can track down the LGBTIQ person and they can report them to the state and the state can take them down. So yeah, that's what's happening with the situation of the LGBTIQ and the sexual
rights in Indonesia. There are two main ideologies behind this. First, it is the more capitalist, exploitative ideology, and the other one is Islam and an oppression of sexual and reproductive rights.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, this is note. We can proceed now to Ghana and stay with the same topic, because Rosalind Nold is a board member of LGBTI+ rights in Ghana. For the past decade, she has been board member, president and secretary of national and international humanist associations and networks. As president of Humanist Association of Ghana, she helped to build the young group to become the umbrella organization for non-religious groups in Ghana and the biggest allies to the LGBTIQ community and feminist movement in Ghana. Rosaline will speak about the ways in which in Ghana the LGBTIQ community and activism has been affected during the pandemic. Please, Rosaline.
Thank you, Krista. And I would like to say, first of all, happy International Women's Day belated to all women. And I'm really pleased to be on this panel with this distinguished, lovely ladies. I'd like to talk today about what's happening with the LGBT community, and I'll give a small introduction of Ghana and the situation at large. So Ghana basically is a West African country. To be brief on the history, 400 years of slavery went through most parts of its shores, and a lot of colonial rule, and Ghana was able to attain its independence. It's the first African country to have attained independence from the British in 1957. Last week, Saturday, 6th March, was a 64th independence celebration. And it's still a pity that we have so many other issues still going on as a third world country, most of the time including issues of LGBT, which is basically a lot of homophobia coming from colonial residues and religious oppression. So I'd like to talk about how we have been doing our activism. LGBT+ Rights Ghana is a group that started 3 years ago and has basically been working to assist people in the community. There have been decades-long fights for freedom and the rights of LGBT persons. However, most of these groups have either had to be under the guise of some kind of human rights organization or gender advocacy group or the other. And for a long time, the issues of LGBT rights was not brought forward because of, sorry, next slide. Next slide, please. An old colonial rule that was brought by the British and has never been changed, even though our constitution has been changed twice. And basically the law talks about natural carnal knowledge, and this is supposed to be affecting heterosexual and homosexual couples, basically criminalizing anal sex and fellatio. But this law has been only used against those in the LGBT community, making it look like it's illegal and giving more homophobes and vigilante groups the power to go ahead to abuse and attack people in the LGBTQIA+ community. Next slide, please. Some of the abuses that have been going on are this list, and especially from during the pandemic, it's happened that we've had a lot more family social ostracization, because sometimes even those who were living away from their family, the homophobic families, were forced to go and live again with their families, either because they've lost a job, or because they, due to the lockdown, which happened for just a couple of weeks, had to go back to their families. And so this caused a lot of issues. And we also had a lot more issues with unemployment, especially like Katika mentioned before, similar to that is that most of those from the trans communities and LGBTQ communities are in the creative industry or art industry. And because of the pandemic coming on, lockdown, loss of jobs, businesses, and so on. So, it's rather escalated their issues and also gave more violence towards them because we're more vulnerable in the society. I'll also like, next slide, please. So there was also the issue of, if you go back in the background, in 2017, the current president in his first term in 2017 was given an interview by Al Jazeera's news network. And basically he was asked on the LGBT situation in Ghana, and his response was quite diplomatic, mentioning that, it is bound to happen if there are efforts for advocacy for the issue. But for now, his government and the people are not ready to accept the decriminalization of gay rights in Ghana. However, this does not sit well with the homophobic community. And then, so here comes this lawyer, For Money, who started his national coalition and basically tried to use this as a way to gather religious leaders, politicians, and so on, and especially from the three main religions, Islam, Christianity, and the African traditional religious leaders, to come together to, put pressure on government, basically, to criminalize it further and make life even more difficult for LGBT persons. And this move has not really helped the situation. Initially, all this, he was saying, came with a little push from the LGBT community. Next slide, please. There was also, in 2019, an introduction of the comprehensive sexuality education. This was supposed to be, Ghana has no sex education in our schools, and it was supposed to be a way for Europe to support the government to introduce these things into schools, to help curb teenage pregnancies, and also to give more awareness, especially to those in the rural areas, about contraceptives and how to prevent HIV/AIDS spread and so on, and basically hygiene and stuff for children. However, the coalition came once again claiming this to be a gay agenda and a way for Europe to enforce its culture on us and to indoctrinate our children to be gay. They also came up with their own conference in October 2019, funded by World Congress of Families, which is a very extremist hate group. It's a right-wing group from the United States of America. And they came here specifically to let people know that, they are here to support the coalition, to pressure government once again to pass laws, like similar to what was passed in Uganda with the Kill the Gays bill that they tried to introduce into their parliament. And this also went again without much how do you call it, like any talk from the LGBT community. The community was quiet once more and not really talking about it. But then early part of 2020, there was announcement of a pan-African first ever lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, intersex, and asexual conference in Ghana. It was the 10th anniversary of PI, this international group, especially based in South Africa, I believe, and they were going to move their conference here to have that celebration. And it caused an uproar led by, again, this national coalition to let Ghanaians know, hey, what did we say? They're going to bring gayism, as they call it, or homosexuality into our country. And even though this is an African conference, it still came with a lot of backlash. Unfortunately, that was just when the COVID hit most parts of Africa, and by March, this conference was supposed to be in June, but by March, there was talks of lockdowns and so on, and so the conference was cancelled. And next slide, please. So if we move forward, once the pandemic hits and with this news coming up, religious leaders decided to start, telling people that it was because of homosexuality. That's what brought the pandemic on Ghana, even though this is a global pandemic. And they also tried to make it, spiritualize it, that it's a bad spirit to be a homosexual or to be a lesbian or trans. And so, like, with a lot of religion and superstition in the country, Ghana is 95% religious as well, and Christianity takes about 70%. And I'm talking about different denominations, especially with all these charismatic, evangelical, fundamentalist ideas and ideologies. And so it was very, very difficult to tackle it from that point of view, other than the fact that the pandemic itself affected the members of the community in their lack of, unemployment and so lack of employment and so on. And we had cases where once there was an opening of an office, the LGBT plus Rise Ghana group decided to open a first ever office to explicitly and specifically deal with LGBT issues, not hiding behind the curtains on that issue, but rather to start to speak about how we can address the issues and abuses against members of the community. This was attended by the Australian High Commissioner, the Danish ambassador, and an EU ambassador to Ghana. The fact that the presence of these people were there created an uproar. And again, the coalition led by lawyer Fuamani went to the media claiming that Europe and the rest of the world are trying to bring homosexuality here and are sponsoring this group to do that here in Ghana. And so, Alex, the executive director of the group, was splashed everywhere. His face was splashed everywhere in the media, and it was a very, very, trying time. However, his bravery, along with the staff and so many other allies, came together and went to the media to speak up about these issues. The great thing is that because it was a pandemic era, so it wasn't a time where they have to go in person. We can do everything virtually. And so most of these interviews were done virtually. And allies like us, like me, was able to go to studios to have and face this homophobic rhetoric and try to properly inform and also remove the misconceptions about what homosexuality is and why they deserve their rights and so on. With the police raid, it came with along with the landlord of the house who led the police there, and luckily for us, the executive director and other people who were in the house were able to flee and have been in hiding since. And so they did not face any form of arrest or anything, but still have not been able to function in their own space like they should be doing. The coalition has also gone ahead to announce that they have 7 or 8 other MPs, members of parliament, who are supporting them to introduce a private membership bill. And this private membership bill is basically to say that they want to introduce a clinic that takes care of gay conversion therapy. I don't know about hormone injections or something, because he seems to claim that if they are able to, it can be changed. It's a choice. And so if it's a matter of hormone treatments and all kinds of things and prayers, that would enable them to change. And if they don't change to be straight or heterosexual, then they are going to criminalize and prosecute them. And this has become very serious and like a threat to the community. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so I would like to say that if anyone would like to support us, the group and the community at large, these are some of the things that you can do. Just following us and then sharing goes a long way via social media, informing the Ghanaian High Commissions, protesting, sending letters, or like forcing your government to pay attention to what is going on to LGBT people in their country. Even there have been countries that have before tried to clamp down on our economy, like not giving us enough loans and grants to our government for our development as a country. But I feel like such moves sometimes might even bring a bigger backlash to the community members here. So another way we can do is to place sanctions on homophobic people. If there are people that, especially prominent people who are speaking for homophobia, then these are the people. There's now an anti-LGBT watch list, I believe, that people are doing right now, and it's online. So you can find out, and then we can clamp down on these individuals. There's another way is to donate to the community fund, which is what has helped to bring lawyers and other, ways to rent a place or to get a place for the community and to deal with their issues. I'd like to thank you very much. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, for this critical perspective on current developments in your country, which actually has in Africa a long history and reputation of being democratic and rather liberal. In this case, ultra-conservative religious forces from inside and from outside, of course, are the drivers for the crackdown on the LGBTIQ community and for blaming homosexuals for the spread of COVID-19, what is really shocking. Thanks as well to inform us about the solidarity moves and activities vis-a-vis this community. I have a question for you, if you could answer it quickly. You speak about solidarity activities from outside as well, but we have the experience with Uganda that we ran into dilemma, because in Uganda, solidarity, international solidarity, as you mentioned beforehand as well, towards the LGBTIQ community was accused of being indoctrinated by the West and of being un-African and not loyal to the nation and to the national culture or to the African culture. So it's a kind of dilemma that, of course, people from outside want to demonstrate solidarity, and then it's a backlash for the people in the country. How can we deal with this dilemma?
Yes, basically being an ally to marginalized groups like this comes with, first and foremost, listening to the community. You have to be in touch with the community and find out where let them lead, and then you follow, so that you don't do something else that would result in a backlash to them. Now, a lot of them are ready to stand up for themselves, and so they are moving. The movement is going on, and it's up to us allies, whether Ghanaian or foreign, to stand behind them. Even during this time, we've had celebrities in America like Idris Elba, Naomi Campbell, writing a petition to our president, seeking to that, they agree with what the LGBT community in Ghana is doing, and they are supporting them. So he should take a closer look at them. Rather than doing it just their own way, they are going to behind in support of what is already going on. Another way too is not necessarily coming to the country or bringing the your help directly to the country, like I don't know, like speaking on as a European country or as a foreigner towards the government or so on, but through your own countries. And that's what I was mentioning before, that if you've seen your own leaders, you know, because they come, they visit our countries, they are in business with them, they give us loans and grants. And there are a lot of countries from all over the world that are in Ghana doing business here as well. So these are the things. You are working, if you know that you have somebody from your country or a company here in your country that is dealing and doing business with a minister or a member of parliament here who is openly speaking against the LGBT community and causing systematic persecution of people in the LGBT community, then, you know, these are the ways you should talk to your own and see how, you know, you can help let them also realize that this is what they are supporting indirectly, you understand? And then also creating awareness about these homophobes, placing travel sanctions, for example. These are people, most of them speak against the LGBT community here, but at the end of the day, they have friends in the West, you know, some of whom may be LGBT themselves. You understand? They go to school there, their children go to school there, they go for holidays in Europe and so on. And so if they are seeing that, no, we are not going to allow you to come, be in a country where LGBT people are safe and it's decriminalized, and yet go back to your country and persecute people from the community, then it's not fair. Another way, talking about being an African, we have research of our African history, even though a lot of it was, you know, the colonialism tried to erase that. There is still a lot of research done to show that it's always been like in any other part of the world, part of us as humans. And even in some parts of our African culture, it was praised. It was our ancestors, found it special if you are a queer person. And so for the idea, that's for us to debunk as well, and to let people know that it's not a Western construct. It's a very, very human construct. And basically, you are there to let people know that it was before that colonialism brought homophobia with religion, but now you have changed your mind, and culture is dynamic and the culture can change and we can move from that. The last thing I would like to say too on that is that the same way the West also brings homophobia, like in the case of Uganda you mentioned, a lot of it was from American right-wing evangelicals, yes, right? Bringing the Kill the Gay bill and empowering these pastors to carry that. Yes. So in Ghana, we can also say that Fuamani and the National Coalition tried to bring this right-wing American evangelical group to influence our government, because they had people like this former Speaker of Parliament, Right Honorable Professor Michael Quay, attending these events. And now they are daring to come out with a private membership bill. So we can also say that the West is also trying to bring a lot of homophobia into the country.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Rosalind. That was very clear and helpful. So now we traveled through 4 countries, and I wonder, are there questions for all the 4 speakers, or more general questions not related to a particular country situation? Do we have something in the chat? Anna?
Yes, there's a few questions from before, from during the presentations that we didn't go through before, so maybe we can answer them now. There's 2 for Jennifer. And the first one is, how is obstetric violence attacked or regulated in Poland? Maybe we can answer that one first and then move on to the next one.
Perhaps you should put the 2 questions for Jennifer together.
Okay, and the other one is there a unified power in the executive and legislative power against feminist movements, or are there differences among the state apparatus?
Okay, I would maybe start with the first question. I'm not really a specialist in this issue, but there has been like I think there has been this foundation called like Human Birth Foundation. And I think they have been struggling around this issue about almost 20 years, and that there has been a lot of progress. And there are some regulations according to birth standards, from what I know. So there has been a lot of improvement. And also, yeah, like some ministerial regulations. So it's not like the best situation in Poland. Even sometimes it's kind of an example for other countries in this past, in the former like state socialist region. Yeah, but of course there are like regulations according to how like patients should be treated. But of course there is still like a lot of problems with violence. Also because of course like hospitals are underfunded, and also like from what I know from this foundation, that also just many people don't report issues of violence. And yeah, and from what I read from them is that also like during the pandemic some violence has been increased. For example, women who have like COVID would have like medical treatments, like having, for example, cesarean sections, you know, instead of natural births and things like this. And there would be this some kind of violence. But and still, yeah, of course, you're having like humiliation and all those things are going still on. There is this violence still there, but there are definitely also regulations. This is the first question. The other, like legislative.
Briefly, Jennifer, can you answer it briefly, because we have a number of other questions.
Sorry, yeah. I will. So it's not super unified, and there are very much difference between the regional and the national level. So it's also a field of struggle, and also the jurisdiction system. There's a lot of struggle. So it's not unified. It's still kind of a lot of things going on. But there are the attempts from above and from the government to unify also the executive part more.
Okay, thank you. There was another question for Roxana, whether there is some contestation or resistance from the domestic workers you were talking about. You were talking about the situation of domestic workers in the country. Are they organizing? Is there any resistance?
Yeah, I came across actually a very small labor union from domestic workers, but it's a number that it's hardly over 100 people. So I feel like it's still part of what I was mentioning before, that they consent this type of subordination because they know that if they are portrayed as rebels and as difficult workers, they will simply not be hired. So in order for them to continue to have a job, it's just easier for them to accept this type of abuses. But, yeah.
Yes. And I would like to ask a question, because today, different from the earlier webinars, we didn't talk much about care. So I would like to ask a question to all of you regarding care work and nursing in the corona crisis. Last time we spoke about global care chains, and I know that from all the 4 countries, care workers, healthcare workers are migrating out of the country and leaving the country with a shortage of care workers, healthcare workers, nurses, doctors. And I would like to know a bit from each of the speakers, how is now the situation in the corona crisis, in the hospitals, and of course as well in the households, with so many women having migrated abroad. Perhaps, Kartika, could you start? Indonesia?
Yeah, sure. So last year, the statistics said that more than 635 medical workers or frontline healthcare workers are died were died during due to the COVID, and half of them were nurses and midwives. Yeah, and I would say that the government or the Indonesian government has a problem to put them first or to prioritize the money to protect the healthcare workers, and they prefer to do or spend a lot of money for the parliament members to produce more oligarchy laws than to help their own country or the healthcare workers.
Yeah.
And what's the other problem with this is I found out that a lot of the healthcare workers couldn't go back home because they got neglected in their community or in their village or in their city. So there was a huge, huge problem even until now after the government opened up the Indonesian again.
Okay.
So
that means local communities refused to accept them back. Huh?
Yes, that's also a problem. So that's the reason why a lot of them looking for should like spend more money to like stay in the hotel, even though in the morning they can work more than 20 hours to help the patient of the virus. And yeah, and there was no like very good settlement from the government to looking at for them or to take care of these health workers.
Yeah. Rosalind, can you give us an idea of what is happening in Ghana?
Yes. As for the issue of lack of healthcare or health workers, it's already there. There is even less. The ratio of doctor to patients is very, very wide, and so we don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough doctors nationwide. And with this pandemic, there's even been issues where a lot of the nurses were not getting enough PPEs, to function, to be able to work. And so we also had cases of high levels of infection amongst these healthcare workers. And the United States is one country that came up with a special visa for healthcare workers, especially nurses, to migrate to the US. And I don't know the statistics on that, but I think that a lot of people, I can see how there'll be a lot of people taking advantage of that opportunity to go, because you're going to get enough PPEs and be safe in a better, safer working environment and better pay. So I can see that brain drain happening here. And so definitely it's going to be affecting, people here in Ghana, especially those patients from who are infected by the virus here, if there are not enough health workers here.
Okay. Roxana and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I'm not very familiar with numbers of women migrating as nurses specifically. More of women migrating as nannies or housekeepers to the countries of the north. However, I think that in the country there was already a shortage of nurses, because this is a well-known profession that it's underpaid. And a lot of people say that whoever goes into this profession, it's by pure vocation and because they actually want to help people. So I think that the government, the measure that they took was to to rebuild some hospitals and to put a couple of more resources, but little was spoken about nurses as care workers. And I remember that during the lockdown, with the stop of the public transportation, there was this notice of a woman who didn't have how to reach the hospital. She was a nurse, and the media, what they did was to romanticize that she was going to the hospital in a bicycle in a country that it's very different than here in Germany to ride a bicycle, so yeah.
Okay, Jennifer. Thank you, Roxana.
I must say, I feel it's really hard to really get a clue what's really going on according to this whole pandemic situation also in Poland, because the information is doesn't seem so very reliable. So I don't know what is the situation actually in the hospitals. And there was also some law which did forbid like talking about. So the medical staff could not talk about some things. So, and there's not so much testing going on. And I know that a lot of people also don't go to hospitals. But yeah, in general, there has, and I don't know exactly the statistic about the migration, but for sure we're having the same situation that a lot of like medical staff and especially like nurses are going to the West. And you could see this very clearly when the borders were closed, for example, between Germany and Poland, that there was really a problem that the nurses in the German hospitals would not be there because they were actually driving from Poland to Germany. So it was really like seen as a problem also in the elderly houses, that yeah, we need the workers from the East in the West. So there's kind of structurally the healthcare systems are also based like on this labor from migration, and there's not enough of such specialists in Poland.
Okay, actually our time is up, but I would like to invite you to a last quick round, because we have the question, and it's very clear after listening to the four of you, that we are then scared. What will be the new normal after the pandemic? Will the trends we observe now of authoritarian and undemocratic policy measures, will this establish and continue and root in the future? Or are there perhaps chances to focus much more on care work and rebuild movements who ask for sexual and reproductive rights, movements that ask for rights of LGBTIQ people, and so on? So just a brief perspective, how do you see it? What do you expect? Where do you see chances, and where do you see closures, at least for some time? Who wants to start? Roxana?
I think I can start. Yeah, I actually see both, because as I was mentioning in the beginning of my presentation, now this president has a lot of political power, and it really depends on him how this will continue in the country. But also I see an opportunity, because a lot of feminist movements are raising, and more women are currently raising their voices. So they're trying to be heard, but still I feel like it's very challenging with a government that has full power and has no gender knowledge.
Okay. Rosalind, do you want to continue?
I think it's quite similar to what Roxana was saying. As much as there is a democracy in Ghana, the religious oppression and stuff is what gives pressure to Ghana in a secular constitution to enforce this authoritarian rule over especially marginalized groups, women, women's rights, and LGBTQ rights. But I think that as much as the community is also ready to now stand up for their rights, it might help, that the change is just starting. And so I'm just hoping that with international help, especially, that also has a very big role to play in all this. But at the same time, knowing that we are a young nation and we are going to continue growing, and so will our democracy and the way we deal with things, especially now the pandemic has made us see how close we are as a globe, with so many other countries than we thought, because it doesn't take too much to get a virus from any other part of the world coming into your own country. And so it's made us, a little more aware and conscious of the fact that we have to, pay more attention, especially to our healthcare workers and all that, rather than what our country government is doing right now, trying to build a national cathedral, which obviously did not become a priority during the pandemic.
Okay. Kartika, can you continue?
Yeah, so I was surprised by the last Women March in Indonesia. I saw like huge increasing numbers of young feminists in Indonesia to raise their voice of, like gender equality. And I think this is a very right time to cultivate and to like harvesting this politic movement to more go towards to defend women's rights. And since as I already mentioned in my conclusion in my slides, that the segregation of the more or Indonesian activists now is more like inclusive. So I would say that that's also really important now to really organize the movement and connect the feminist movement with the people's movement. And also it's interesting that in the Southeast Asia, the movement of the Southeast Asia in fire now. And this is a good time as well to organize the solidarity across the Southeast Asian. That's for me.
Okay, and Jennifer?
Okay, I think I said already a little bit, I think it's hard to predict because we're really having these two completely opposite movements. But what I see, like, and what I think it's probably super important, we can see it from the history also of past movements, that basically like having like solidarity infrastructures and like practicing care and like keeping this in mind, how important it is. Because I can see like there's this immense solidarity between people. It's really incredible to see how many different social groups starting to like spontaneously like support each other. So yeah, it's really the question how kind of this idea of solidarity can be the most central thing and maybe being something that bridges like the social antagonism. Because right now when you have this social antagonism, is also the question, how are we going to move on with this? Because like the political violence is getting so intense. So I think it's very important, but I'm not able to say where it will go. It's so many issues that can influence it. And you see the dynamics is sometimes changing from one week to the other, where you just think, oh no, what's happening now? And then you think, oh, this is so amazing. And it's, you know, up and down.
Okay, thank you so much, Jennifer, and all the speakers. I think we had a wonderful conversation. It was extremely informative and interesting. And in the end, it gives us quite some hope that we will continue with our struggles. Thank you so much. I would like to hug all of you. Unfortunately, not this time, but I hope another time. Thank you. Have a nice evening, and hope to see you for another occasion. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.